A message today from Parliament, from the Senate in fact, for the Prime Minister to meet with a group of former emergency workers headlined by 5 former fire commissioners. They want to talk about action on fires but also action on climate change. Earlier I spoke with one of them, Greg Mullins, a former New South Wales Fire and Rescue Commissioner.
Look, there were things that could have been done, like the leasing of more heavy aircraft from the Northern Hemisphere. But I want to say it's time to draw a line under that. We can't do anything about the past, it's about the future. I'm hoping that the Prime Minister will be able to bring together the Coalition, Labor, the Greens, the crossbenchers, and deal with this national emergency. And the national emergency is climate change, and it's driving natural disasters like these catastrophic bushfires. It's time to act, and it's time to come together.
I want to get into climate change and everything that entails later on, but in terms of the practical elements of dealing with bushfires, the RFS has told us the biggest issue has been hazard reduction, and the issue they have had was actually conditions in terms of, suitable days to be able to conduct that. Do you accept the government couldn't have done much about that?
Look, hazard reduction has been very difficult to do because of climate change. So the narrowing of windows, we used to burn off a lot in winter. There's been up to a 25% reduction in winter rainfall, leaving it far too dry and dangerous. Winds are stronger, temperatures are higher, so we just can't burn off at times where we used to burn off. So that's the big issue. Climate change is making that harder, and it's making the bushfires start earlier in August instead of October and burn far more intensely.
The issue you mentioned there with planes, and yes, you say you want to draw a line under this, but this applies to future seasons as well, obviously. It's a state responsibility, isn't it? There's some help from the federal government, but shouldn't state governments be taking this approach? Isn't it up to them?
Look, there was an agreement between the states and territories and the Australian government back in 2003 for a 50-50 sharing of costs for firefighting aircraft. Since then, the states and territories have just tipped in more and more money. The federal government has not. It's now 9-1. So 90% of the cost is being borne by states and territories, 10% by the federal government. They've had a business case for 2 years that they've sat on and haven't answered for more funds. We could have had more aircraft here, but again, let's talk about the future. Let's see what can be done right now and later.
And the more funding you were calling for, and again, this goes into the future as well, was this something you were advocating for when you were still in the job as Commissioner?
Look, I've actually been pushing for more firefighting aircraft since 1995 when I did a Churchill Fellowship study in France, Spain, Canada and the US on this very subject. 2003 was a great thing when the arrangements were put in place, but more needs to be done because the situation is so much more dire than it used to be.
The number of firefighters we have as well, I mean, if the situation is worse now and getting worse no matter what happens, because the world's not going to suddenly turn off its carbon output, what's that going to mean for the future firefighters?
Look, there's going to need to be far more firefighters in the future, paid, and that's organisations like Fire and Rescue in New South Wales, National Parks, Forestry, the specialist people there, and far more volunteers. And unfortunately, the number of volunteers, as we saw in the Productivity Commission report recently, is going down. People are leaving, so we need to have research into how we can support and attract more volunteers. It needs to be a national effort. So we don't have all the answers, but we've got a lot of experience. We'd like to see a national summit called by the government with key players like the fire services, the insurance industry, the military, the Weather Bureau, CSIRO, scientists, and come up with new solutions.
Right, a new approach given the increased threat. So on climate change, you're saying the Australian government should be taking more action. To what extent could that change things? I mean, we know we've got relatively small emissions overall output. Yes, a high per capita, but low overall. What impact do you think we could have on the world?
Look, our emissions are not low compared to the rest of the world. We're in the top 20 emitters of greenhouse gases. We do need to take action. Emissions have been going up for the last 5 years, not down. But let's all get together, work out ways that we can transition away from oil, coal and gas, because the burning of that creates CO2 and other greenhouse gases, warms the world, then we get more bushfires, worse cyclones, worse floods, more natural disasters. So we need to deal with the base problem, but adapting to the more dangerous here and now, I was going to say future, but it's with us and getting worse, that's very, very expensive because we've done nothing in the past. But let's forget the past, let's work together in the future.
So our emissions, as I said, quite high per capita, very high per capita, but 1.3% overall. The much bigger impact, the argument goes by some, is about coal. When you look at Australia as the biggest exporter of coal in the world, the feedback from the last election was that when one party at least oscillates on coal and whether or not it should be a part of Australia's future, i.e. Labor, they got punished. Are Australians for now, or at least as of the last election, still more worried about protecting the economy?
Look, when it comes down to individuals, I mean, if it's about my job and feeding my family, of course I'm concerned. I can understand coal miners who rely on their wages to look after their family. They'd be very concerned if there was a transition away. You look to countries like Germany, where they transitioned into new industries, new high-paying jobs, and it took a long time. So fair and just transition. We have the CFMEU saying the same thing. We need to work together to transition away from fossil fuels, move to renewables, and change the economy for the better. Ross Garnaut was saying we can be an international powerhouse in renewables and other things which will help transition the world to a safer future.
So you think it's about the specific message? You're not taking the last election as that Australians are not ready to, say, have a climate change election, as it was called, that they were more worried about the economy?
Look, perhaps there wasn't enough information, perhaps there was too much information. I'm not a political expert. The Labor Party, I know, has had a dissected what went wrong for them, but I'd just like to see a bipartisan approach. It's happened in places like the UK. Conservatives accept that climate change is a problem and things must be done. Why not in Australia? Aren't we smart enough to do that? Please, Prime Minister, bring everyone together.
Now, you were seeking a meeting with the Prime Minister. My understanding is you were offered a meeting with Angus Taylor. This was around the time of the caretaker period. Did you have a reluctance to meet with him, and why, if so?
Well, look, actually, I wrote to the Prime Minister on 2 occasions, April and May. I received a response in July that indicated Minister Taylor would be in touch. I received that communication in September, an offer of a meeting. I wrote back and said, could you please get the Natural Disasters Minister there, maybe the Finance Minister and the PM? The answer a week later was no. I wrote to the Prime Minister and asked if he would help organise a meeting with the relevant ministers, and I never received a response. But look, the good thing is Minister Littleproud has been in touch. He seems very keen to talk about the problems and what can be done. We rule a line under the past. Forget all that. Let's get together and work on this problem. You're
saying, though, that the big issue, in your opinion, going forward is about climate change. Why wouldn't it be appropriate to meet Angus Taylor rather than David Littleproud?
No, I'm happy if Minister Taylor comes as well, and that's what I asked for. I'm confident that now that the door's been opened by Minister Littleproud, good talks will go ahead. We'll be able to come up with solutions. I know that he is listening.
What do you make of the government's approach on climate change?
Much more needs to be done. I'll leave it at that. I don't want to criticise.
They do seem to be doing what they said they'd be doing at the last election, though, right?
Which wasn't enough. Our emissions have gone up year on year for the last 5 years, so obviously more needs to be done. But we'll be discussing that behind closed doors.
Right. So, I mean, you've obviously made a political move by going into the areas you have, but you're only willing to go so far at the moment?
Look, unfortunately, climate change in Australia is political. I personally don't understand that. I wish it was not so, and I hope in the future, now that we're seeing the cost in lives and homes lost of extreme weather, record extreme weather we've never experienced before, leading to record bushfires we've never experienced before, and it's the same, they're talking about having Category 6 cyclones and flooding like in Townsville last year. This is driven by climate change. We need to take more action. We can't change the past, we can change the future for the better.
Can I ask you just finally, actually, back on hazard reduction? There's been commentary this week that there's an element of councils blocking what might happen, whether it be large-scale burns or even just clearing out property. We're getting anecdotal evidence at Sky News. People are saying, well, we can't even collect firewood in national parks, stuff that's on the ground. That adds to fuel. Would you support any of those assertions?
Look, I've heard a lot of assertions about whose fault these fires are, but there was a clamping down on talking about climate change, which was interesting. You can talk about these things, but not that. There's a lot of hazard reduction going on, and I've got to take my hat off to the New South Wales government, the Victorian government, who have put more resources into hazard reduction. But the facts are, because of climate change, the window for hazard reduction is closing each year. Longer and longer fire seasons, drier, hotter, less rainfall. We're losing control of a lot of hazard reduction burns. So it's actually not what people are saying. Individuals might have a local issue that they're worried about, but across the board, there's actually more hectares being burnt than before. But the strategic stuff, some of the strategic stuff can't be done because of climate change.
Greg Mullins, thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Tom.